Okay, so what we're looking at here, I'm going to start off with looking at the external symptoms of a grief process. And what I basically mean by that is, what are the things that people might observe from the outside that might tell them that either somebody that they know is experiencing a grief process, or they themselves might be in a grief process. Now, I'm not saying that all of these things show up necessarily, but these are some of the things that might give you a clue if you see changes in these areas. Now, your loss happens, and the first thing that happens is that you go into a bit of a shock. Loss has happened. I've lost something important to me, and there may be an initial period of, I don't really know what to do. It's just so overwhelming, the fact that this thing that has always been a part of my life, or that I thought was always going to be part of my life, is now no longer there. I don't know what to do with that. So, and with the shock, you can have some changes that happen within your body. One can be your energy levels can change. And this can go in either direction. It could be that suddenly you have no energy, or suddenly you have this excess of energy and you're just going crazy. And the important thing is that there's a change to the energy levels that you would normally experience. Okay, so energy might be really high or really low, but whatever the case, it's different from what is your normal. Okay, you might experience tension in your body in lots of different ways. It could be tension in your back, it could be tension in your shoulders, it could be tension in your neck. You might find that you've got aches and pains that show up in different parts of your body. You might find that your stomach is just constantly clenched and feeling like, oh, I'm somewhat nauseous. It's just feeling really tight. And that can have knock-on effects to other things that you might experience in your body. Okay? Your appetite, for one. Okay, you might find that suddenly you're not hungry at all, or you are ravenous and you're just eating all the time. And again, it's about the change from what you normally do. So, other people may not notice it as much as you do, or maybe they will notice it more than you do. I know when I went through the horrible year in 2001, my appetite just totally went, and I was just eating because I knew that I had to. I would have lunch, I'd make a lunch, I'd eat it, but I really didn't want to. I didn't feel hungry. I didn't really want to have anything, but I just knew that I needed it to be able to keep going through the day. I didn't enjoy it. And it was a minimal lunch. It wasn't big meals. I just couldn't handle big meals at all. So appetite can change. But as I said, other people, it might go to the point of like, I'm doing comfort eating all the time. And that kind of stuff. And maybe even the type of food that you tend to gravitate towards might change. So that can be interesting. I mean, some people will go for sweet, some people will go for more savory, some people will go for a lot of your protein, salads. I don't know. I mean, it can vary, but yeah, a whole lot of things.
Grieving with salad.
Grieving with salad. Yes, I deny myself protein or something. I don't know, but yeah, I mean. So your appetite can change. Your sleep can be interrupted. You might find that you either sleep lots and you just find it very difficult to wake up, or you find that you can't sleep and you're just constantly, things are playing on your mind, or you're just laying in bed and your body just will not shut down and go to sleep. So it can go in either direction. And again, it's about the change from what your normal is. So if you've been a person that was always a really good sleeper and you have a loss and suddenly you're not sleeping well, that can be an indication of your grief. Or if you're a person that has always been a very light sleeper and suddenly you're just doing the sleep of the dead and are sleeping like 15 hours and you've never been able to do that before, that could also be an indication that you're in a grief process.
And so how long might, I mean, I know I've talked about grief having no timetable, but how long might you see these particular changes or symptoms for?
It's hard to say. I mean, it will vary. Sometimes the noticing them allows them to kind of dissipate and for you to return back to normal. Sometimes, depending upon the magnitude of the loss, they might linger for quite some time. For some people, it might be it almost becomes a permanent change. And some of these changes you don't want to have as permanent changes, but yeah, it's you just need to pay attention to it. My guess is that again, using that year thing, time frame, it's not hard and fast, but if it's still there after a year, I'd be starting to ask some questions. If it's causing you problems in a shorter time frame, I would also start doing some exploration around what it is that's going on for me and how can I actually do this? Because unfortunately, if your sleep and your appetite are interrupted in negative ways, that can also prolong your grief process because your body actually is no longer getting as much fuel or as much opportunity to recharge. So it can have a knock-on effect. So you kind of need to weigh up, is this actually having a long-term effect for me? And should I do something about this now, or should I just ride it out? For some people, they can ride it out because it's not too severe. But if it is severe and it's having major impacts on your ability to engage in daily life, I'd probably err on the side of that this is time to start engaging with counselling or going to my GP or getting some kind of assistance to be able to work through some of these things so that my body is actually assisting me to work through the grief process rather than sitting there creating other problems. So sleep, your engagement with the outside world can change. So it can be, and this could be, when you explore stuff around personality later, this might be a personality thing. You might go towards people and activity and so on as a way to avoid, or you might go away and withdraw uncharacteristically. So, and again, there are personality things that come into play with that. But when the loss comes in, it might be more pronounced, or it might be quite opposite to what you actually do. So you might find maybe you're an introvert and normally you would go internally, but that's too hard to go there. So you go into the external space a lot more than you normally would. Okay. Your focus, you might find that you're a scatterbrain, or you might find that you are so intensely focused on particular things, you zone everything else out in a way that you don't normally do. And again, there are continuums, and it's neither right nor wrong which end of that scale you're in. It's very much more about like noticing that you're doing something that's different from what your regular pattern is, and this might be an indicator of how significant this loss has been to you. Okay, so focus. Your memory might be impacted. You might find that your short-term memory might be shot for the short time, for a while, that you're just not able to grasp the details of what's going on from day to day. You're forgetting things easily. You might find that your memory is gravitating to the past a lot. You might find that your memory might be very sharp for the details, but very fuzzy with broader things, or vice versa. But yeah, I mean, the grief process, memory is attached to your frontal cortex, which is a lot of your logic and so on. And when you're in a grieving process, you're actually tapping more into the limbic system, which is about your feeling and your survival type of stuff. So memory may take a back seat, and that can happen in a grief process. So, or it may alter how you remember things. So that can be an indicator that you're dealing with loss. Your emotions, there are a range of them. I'm going to talk in a little bit about the range of emotions that can show up. So I'm not going to say too much here, but just to recognize that when you go through loss, other people may notice emotions that you don't normally display more, or they may notice you being less emotional than you normally are. And again, it's about that change of what's your normal, what's your regular pattern. The loss interrupts that. And so you may go one way or the other. And again, it's neither it's right or wrong. It's just like your world has been upset. It's been totally torn apart by the loss, and your emotions will have a response to that in some way, shape, or form. And the intensity, again, will give you an indication as to how significant something was. And it might also give you a clue that it might not be the current loss that might not just be the current loss that you're grieving. It could be some old ones that are somehow getting integrated into this experience of loss. Okay, and your tolerance for things. I mean, when you're not feeling well, you don't tolerate noise, light, people being critical, all that kind of stuff. Your tolerance for things on a daily basis can be reduced, or you might tolerate something that you've never been able to tolerate before because you can just tune it out in a way that you never could, because something else has come to the fore and that's your focus. And so therefore other things are a bit, that's small potatoes type of thing now in light of what I'm experiencing. So those things, the tolerance may change. Those 9 things are all things that could be somewhat observable from the outside, and you might notice those things happening within your body and within your thoughts. There are a range of different common emotional experiences that can show up with the grief process. And I'm just going to go into that now and just talk about those things there.
Just
now,
before you do, with all of those things, really, it is just to help you notice that you have changed, that you're doing something or feeling something different, and that is a moment for pause to go, actually, have I lost something? What has changed? Like you asked in the beginning, has something changed recently? And could that be related to this?
Yes.
And because I think,
or if somebody gives you the feedback, it's like you're not yourself. That could also be a clue that, hey, somebody else is noticing that I'm not behaving in the way that I tend to. So has something happened that's shifted me into a different space, and what's that about?
Because a lot of the challenge I have around either disenfranchised grief or grief, which once you've done the big intense grief, just sort of the everyday grief, is realizing it's there. And I think these are really good clues to help you go, actually, I am a bit off. What's off and what has changed? And it's a really good process.
And some of those things may show up at particular points in time. To give you a clue, like for me, when my mother died, I didn't have a great emotional outpouring at the time because there's a lot of stuff that was going on. And I wasn't sure exactly what my grief process was going to look like. Of course, I hadn't lost a parent before, so it's just like I didn't know how I was going to respond at all. And what I found is that people said, "Oh, the milestones like my mother's birthday, my parents' wedding anniversary, Christmas and Easter, Mother's Day, you're probably going to feel things around that." It's like, okay, so I was expecting that, but I didn't. It was like my mother's birthday. It's like, that was very soon after she died, so it was close. It was like, okay, I felt a little something, but it wasn't as strong as I would have expected. But what ended up happening was that about 6 months later, I ended up having this strange experience where it was just like, I'm feeling really, really not great. It's like, and I wasn't unwell. I was like, I don't really get what's going on. It's like, and it took me a little bit to twig what was going on, but it was like that 6 month mark was actually the month in which Mum had first started having hospitalizations. And so my process, and when I suddenly clicked, it was like, June, Mum went into hospital the first time. It was like, okay, she went into hospital the second time in August. So I expected something in August, and I expected something in October when she went in for another hospitalization that led to open heart surgery. And the anniversary of her death was in November. And I thought, well, the anniversary of death I thought would be significant. Well, that first one wasn't that significant for me, because I think my body was tracking the decline of my mother. And so here it was in that first year, I'd only got to the October of the open heart surgery. I hadn't got to the next hospitalization, which happened in April of the next year, which then was the beginning of the end for her. And she died at the end of that next year in 2017. So the second anniversary of her death was probably a little bit harder than the first. But it was like, and I don't think I would have, if I hadn't have done my own grief work and had some understandings of how grief can operate, I'm not sure I would have realized what was going on at all. I would have just thought, oh, I'm just having an off month. I don't get it. And then it would have hit me again. And then it was just like, what's going on? But I kind of anticipated it. And so it was just like, okay, I can expect August might be a little bit difficult. So if it is difficult, this will be why. And I can just let it be.
When you were talking about emotions and having no emotions, because I often associate grief with having lots of emotions, it reminded me when I was living in London and had seasonal affective disorder. That's what we diagnosed it as. But I remember saying to various, health practitioners, I just don't feel anything. I feel completely dead inside. It feels like my world has turned to black and white, which is just not normal for me. And I was experiencing a lot of health issues at the time, but there was a lot of change. I was living in a new city because I was so unwell. I wasn't able to travel. Like I was losing all the things that your overseas experience is meant to be like.
Yes.
And
So
I
the hopes
never
and dreams.
thought of that as potentially a grief process, or I was grieving at the time.
And the health issues were compounding the grieving experience, or the experience of loss. So okay, so the emotion side of things, that as I was saying earlier, it's like these are common. Not everyone experiences all of them. And you don't necessarily experience them in any particular order. So I'm going to, for the sake of a bit of clarity, I'm going to give you clusters of things that might be connected so that you can see what's going on here. But this is not to say that these show up together. They can, but not necessarily so. Okay, so one of the things that can happen is numbness. I'm not feeling anything. Excuse me, I've just got to go turn my battery on. Sorry. So one of the things that you can experience is numbness. Initially, it's like, I don't feel anything, just like you were describing there. It's just like this loss has happened. I suspect I should be feeling something, but I'm feeling nothing. And that can be a bit of a self-protection type of thing. It's just like, this loss is really new. I don't really know what to do with it. I'm just feeling numb. And sometimes that can linger for a while. Sometimes it may be a very short momentary experience, but numbness can show up.
I didn't even know that numbness was a feeling, because
it's more like an absence of feeling.
It's the absence of feeling. But when I would say to my therapist, I'm not feeling anything, which meant I couldn't do anything with that. But once she said, what she labeled it as, well, you're feeling numb, that was data you could do something with. It shifted out of nothingness into actually this is something. And that was a really important distinction I found.
Yep, and the whole numbness thing can be very much about, as I said, self-protection, but also about, I don't know what to feel. It's like there can be conflicting emotions around this, and I don't know what I actually feel about this, and I need time to actually sift through what's going on. So the numbness can be a delaying tactic in some respects, and your body just knows to do that. It's not like you have to force that. So that can show up. It doesn't show up in every situation, but it can show up. Okay. Denial we talked about earlier, and denial, it's got a place. Its purpose there is to allow me to get on with the things that I need to get on with in daily life. So I'm shelving for the moment the loss, because I've got other things that I need to do at the moment that are important to my survival. So so I'm going to deny this for the time being. As I said earlier, though, denial should not become a way of life, because the loss doesn't go away just because you pretend it's not there. It will still be there, and it will still exert an influence on you, whether you accept that it's there or not. So denial is short-term. It needs to be short-term, and there needs to be space for acknowledging what actually is, instead of pretending that life is just going on as normal. Okay. Bargaining is something that people can do in a loss process. The bargaining is about trying to reverse the loss in some way, shape, or form. So it could be, if I go and lose weight, I will get back to the way things were. If I go and get fit, if I do this, if I do that, if I sit there and change my behavior, somehow we can go back to what life was like before this loss happened. And the whole thing with bargaining is that you're trying to sit there and reverse what you've experienced. And unfortunately, you've experienced it. It's like, even if you went back to the way things were, you've already been through the experience of loss. It's changed you. It's changed you, and it's changed the way that you approach life. So bargaining ultimately doesn't work, but it's something that we commonly engage in to try and help ourselves to work our way through the loss. And the process of bargaining can be a way of actually coming to terms with this loss actually happened. So, and that denial
Right,
is,
so that's interesting. So the bargaining, it can be a way of helping you come to terms with the loss. It's not just it's not an avoidance strategy.
it can be both. It can be both. But I mean, it starts off with like, I feel so terrible the way life is now. Wouldn't it be great if life was the way it was before? And that rosy-colored glasses type of thing can come into play, where it's just that life was so much better then. So what can I do to get back to that? And you'll notice with children in particular, that they do this quite obviously, and it can be major behavior shifts that go on with children. To say, like, if I was a very boisterous child and this loss happened, suddenly I become a non-boisterous child because apparently it was my boisterousness that caused this loss to happen. So if I become a non-boisterous child, maybe we can go back to before. And I mean, not all children will do that, but there's this whole, I'm trying to navigate with the things that I have some control over, and unfortunately, I don't have control over going back into the past.
Right. Because it does remind me a little bit about after relationships end. You're like, oh, what if we did this? If what we did this, we could get back together if this, that, and the other. And I hadn't really thought of that as a bargaining process or a way of trying to come to terms with the loss, because it seems like, well, actually, if we can get back together, we haven't lost anything. But that's, you've still already experienced a loss of some form.
Yes, and the relationship has changed because of even if you did get back together again, you'd had the experience of breaking up. So that now is part of your experience of relationship. So it will never be exactly what it was before. Yeah. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, but it's just different. And people, the bargaining says, I want to go back to exactly the way it was before this happened, which means that I somehow have to expunge the memory of what it is that I've just experienced out of my life. But that's impossible. Yeah. So yeah. So bargaining, anger can be a big one. It's more common than people realize. Sometimes people stuff it down and pretend that it's not there, but the anger is often directed externally at the things that I can't control. So bargaining didn't work. I couldn't reverse it. I'm just angry because I don't have answers. I don't understand why this is the way it is. I don't like it. I don't want it. And I can't change it. And I mean, the whole energy of anger is very much, in my opinion, about wanting to make change and wanting to make things better. But with the case of a loss, it's like making it better might mean accepting the pain that is, to be able to get through. And the pain is like, I don't want to feel the pain. I don't want it. I don't want it. I don't want it. You can imagine the tantrums and the stamping feet type of thing. This is not what I signed up for. Okay. And so the anger will often be sitting there with these unanswerable questions, like the whys, the what could I have done differently, the a whole bunch of things that's just like beating myself up or raging against the system type of thing, because it's like, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I wanted, and this is what I've got, and I want to make it different and make it better.
And so not everyone experiences anger. Anger is more common than I think people think or expect.
Yep. And you might find yourself with, it might be low levels of anger. It might be things like resentment. It might be things of irritation, being very easily irritated by stuff, annoyance, all that kind of stuff. That could be low levels of anger that are probably possibly a bit more socially acceptable. So, or we can downplay it. I know for me, I spent years having a very difficult relationship with anger. I didn't believe that I could be angry for a long time. And so I would always say, I'm not angry, I'm upset. Which is like, well, actually, I was angry. I was angry and I couldn't acknowledge it at the time. And and learning how to live with the anger is a whole conversation in itself. But anger can be something that shows up during a grief process and can show up multiple times. So don't be surprised if it does show up. And not everybody,
a stage or a phase. It can just, come and go as appropriate or needed.
And that's true for any of these things. It's like there's nothing that says that it goes in a particular sequence or how long it should stay, or whether it only shows up by itself, or whether it has to show up with a cluster of things. It's like every person's experience is going to be different. And some people don't experience any of these things that I've said so far. They might experience some of the other ones. Okay. This feeling of being in limbo. That in limbo feeling of like, I'm stuck. I can't go back to where I was, but I don't know where to go next. And that could be, I don't know what my options are now that this loss has happened, or there are now so many options, I don't know what to choose. And so it can be a really, really difficult experience. I had a client describe this once, this in limbo phase of like, I'm inside a bubble and I'm watching the world going on around me, but I can't actually participate in it. So it's just like, I'm just suspended here in this space and I can't go forward or backwards or do anything. I had another client that talked about, it's like they were surrounded by a fog. They were sitting there at a crossroads and they couldn't work out which way to go because the fog was there, and they didn't want to take a step because they couldn't see what the future was. But just this whole feeling of feeling stuck. I'm feeling stuck where I am. It's not where I want to be, but I don't know how to get out of this space. So it could be related to numbness, but it could also be an experience in its own right. So, right. And a surprising emotion that can show up is relief. And a lot of times when relief shows up after a loss, people are really confused by that. Like, I shouldn't be feeling good about this can be a common experience. It's just like, and yet the loss can actually provide, in some ways, a way out of some difficult circumstances or out of responsibilities that you've been carrying that you no longer wanted, or maybe never wanted, or this, that, and the other. And there can be components of this relief. I mean, the relief when my mother died, the relief was that she was no longer suffering. And I mean, there was a part of me that says, well, I should be missing my mother more. And it's like, but where she was before she died, it was like she had no quality of life. So it was just like, it was a relief that she died. It was hard. It was hard, but it was in some respects, it was also a relief because she was out of suffering, and we then didn't have to make any more difficult decisions about her care.
Did you feel guilty about being relieved? Because I can imagine that could go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, and we're going to come to guilt in a little bit as well. So that's actually one of the things that can show up. Okay, so those ones here, a lot of these ones in this little cluster that I've presented now have come out of reflecting on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's theory of stages of grief. So she talks about denial and bargaining and anger, but not so much about relief or in limbo and numbness. But one of the things that I like about her process of dealing with grief is that she actually identifies that you actually go somewhere with grief. It's not just you sit in it, you actually move through grief. One of the things that I find difficult with the original experience, the original theory that she developed, was that she said it went in very discrete stages. And my experience of grief is that it's not that cut and dried. So it's like, there are people that will sit there and say, I've been in the denial phase, I'm out of that now. And it's like, well, actually, it might come back again. You might experience anger at multiple periods in your grief process. It's not just I've had it once, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think later in life she actually revised her theory. But anyway, be that as it may, some other things that can show up. This little cluster of sadness, regret, and guilt. Now, I distinguish between these three things. They are related, but I distinguish between them like this. Sadness is, I recognize how much I miss the thing that I lost. So it's about a missing of it. It's like, I'm feeling the absence of this thing that I lost, and it's getting me right in here. Okay. Regret is, I'm not just feeling the loss and feeling the absence of the thing, but I'm also wishing that something had been different. Either I had done something differently or not done something, or whether someone else had done something differently or not done something. And there's all of these what ifs that go on with regret. So it's like, I've lost this thing. I'm feeling its absence, and I wish it had been different. So, and then there can also be guilt, and the guilt could be, as you mentioned earlier, connected with I'm feeling relief and I'm not sure that I should be, or it could be about I feel like I've somehow contributed to this loss and it's my fault. So, and there might be other variations of that, but those are two that just come to mind. So not everybody experiences guilt with a loss. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it can show up. It can show up and can be a part of the whole process of trying to sift through what is my responsibility in this? Did I have responsibility? Was I responsible? Can I hold myself to account for what happened? And if so, to what degree? And some people are just like, it's all my fault. I'm 100% responsible for the loss that happened. And I often have to unpack that to sort of help them to reduce the way they're beating themselves up. It's like, how much control did you really have over this loss? So, I mean, yes, you might have had a significant amount of control over what happened, but could you have stopped it did you know? Could you have known? All those kind of questions can be part of the processing through, because sometimes we just assign ourselves blame when actually there was no way we could have prepared for it. There was absolutely no way that we could have known what was going on. And if we had known, we would have done something differently, but we didn't. And so allowing ourselves to get it off the hook can be part of the process of working through the guilt that can come with loss. Okay, so we just looked at those three. Okay, so and a little bit darker emotions that can show up can be depression, hopelessness, and despair. Now, I realized that they can be really almost interchangeable. They've got some nuances though, and I just wanted to bring them out as different terms, because sometimes we can feel depression without feeling hopeless or feeling despair. Sometimes we can feel despair but not be depressed, which is kind of weird, but it can happen. Sometimes we can feel a hopelessness that's not actually a depression side of things. So the depression, as I define it, is very much about I'm in a dark hole. I can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. It feels like my life is just going to be like this. And so there's a darkness, as I can't see the future. I'm just stuck. I'm here in this pain. I'm here in this sadness. I'm here in this whatever it is that has come with this loss. Okay, so the depression, that's actually very common with loss and with grief. So if that shows up, not too concerned about that unless it lasts for long periods of time. So the recommendation, you go in, I think you can move into clinical depression if you have been experiencing depression for more than 2 weeks. I think that's the standard. I'm going to hold that with a grain of salt, because some people it's going to be shorter or longer, but certainly the longer it goes on, the easier it is to stay in that space. So so depression is one thing. The hopelessness is like, I don't think anything's going to change. So it's like, this loss has happened, it's overturned my world, and this is all I have to look forward to now. There's nothing good ever going to happen again. Okay, which it'd be surprising if that didn't coexist with depression, but it's a different aspect of it. The despair is a further expression of that hopelessness and that stuckness and the sadness. So it's just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do to make things better. So yeah, so there's the sense of like, I've got no power, I've got no future, and this is all I've got, is this darkness. So that can be quite quite difficult.
Very heavy. And I think it's important to mention depression is a normal part of this process, because we often, as in society, we become more aware of depression, discuss it more. I think in some way we've become afraid of it, of depression, and it's something that we have to fix.
Right.
But it
Or
can just be
fight.
an emotional state that we pass through
Yep.
temporarily.
Yes. And so the question is just paying attention to how long it persists for. So if it's going on for like longer than 2 weeks, I would probably get some help at that point. At the worst case scenario, this thing could actually lead to suicidal ideation, where you're actually considering, I need to end my life because this loss has just made my life so terrible. Hopefully people don't get to that stage, but that is a logical flow on if the experience of depression goes on for long periods of time and it's coupled with despair and hopelessness. So keep an eye on those things in the grieving process, because that would be, I would definitely be reaching out if you're noticing that in yourself, or if you're noticing that showing up in somebody that you know is going through a grieving process. At that point, there needs to be some additional intervention. So, yeah. So the other side of things can be a more high energy type of approach, like the sadness and depression and all that side of things over there tend to be more low energy. It's like you're kind of flat and lacking in energy. But you can also have a high energy response to loss where it's, I'm anxious, and this is about the future. I'm really anxious about what's going to be my future now that this thing has happened. Now that I've experienced this loss, what is my future going to look like? So I'm hearing your story about being ill in a city that wasn't your own. You had plans to travel, you had plans to do a whole lot of things, and suddenly that's no longer on the cards. You've got other things to deal with. So what's my future going to be about? I can imagine there was a fair amount of anxiety there about, like, what do I do now? And how am I going to make it happen? So there can be a nervousness, which could be a lower form of anxiety, where it's just like, I don't know what's coming next. I've lost this. What's going to come now? It could be a worry about, like, what am I going to do if something else happens? And almost trying to preempt and plan and prepare for and so on. And again, worry has its place. But again, if all you're doing is sitting there worrying, you're spending all of your time in the future. You're not actually setting things in place in the present. So again, pay attention to how often that's happening and whether or not that's becoming an all-consuming type of thing. A little bit of worry is pretty normal in this whole thing. I mean, your world has changed, and you don't know what your future looks like now, and it does need to be considered and thought through. But if it becomes a source of distress and constant ruminating over what it is that I need to do and preparing for the worst all the time, that's where there are problems, and you probably need to reach out and get some help at that point. So those three might be they are high energy responses that you need to be aware of, and yeah, they can be common, because the loss doesn't just affect your present, it affects your future.
I think that's an important distinction to make between high energy and low energy responses, and they're both normal.
Yep, they're both normal, and you may flip between a high energy response and a low energy response. So it's like, just because you start in one doesn't mean you won't experience the other. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, loneliness and isolation. These are things that I realized are not often addressed in the grief processes, theories. And as I was talking with clients about their experience of grief, these two things seem to show up a lot and is often not acknowledged. Now, loneliness is about, I've experienced this loss and I don't feel that there's anybody here with me in it. So I'm feeling like I'm doing this alone. And there's some truth to that, because I mean, your experience of loss is going to be quite unique. Nobody's going to understand 100% what it is that you're going through, because they're not inside your skin. Okay. However, the lie comes in with loneliness is that nobody will understand any of it. And that's where it gets dangerous there, because then you can move into a whole isolation phase where you can put yourself in isolation because you don't feel that there's anybody anyone's ever going to be there for you. Okay, so the loneliness is, I feel very alone in this experience of loss. The isolation is, I don't feel like there's anybody around. So either you have withdrawn from other people, or other people have withdrawn from you, and that could be real or perceived. So regardless, the whole sense is that I'm here by myself and nobody's reaching out to me, and I don't know how to reach out to somebody else.
But isolation as a whole, like it's natural to want to withdraw in some form, but this is the internal thought or feeling around it almost being permanent or...
And it can be that, as we've talked about earlier, other people being uncomfortable with my experience of loss, that they actually move away because they don't know how to deal with me. Or it could be, I don't want to burden other people with my experience, so I'll pull away from them. I don't want to bring them down, all that kind of stuff. We do all that kind of rationalization there. And again, there's a place for it. I mean, my own experience in 2001 was that I needed the time away from everything to be able to sift through my thoughts and so on. Again, it's about how long you spend in that space. And is it becoming a place that's too comfortable or a place where you're feeling completely separate from the rest of the world? That's where it can become a problem. Okay. Yeah, and its connection with loneliness there is, it's sort of, it can be a chicken or egg type of thing. Am I lonely because I feel isolated, or am I isolated because I feel lonely? Yeah, so it kind of goes round and round and round. Okay. Again, not everybody experiences it. Some people may want isolation and not get it. It's like they're surrounded by people who can't leave them alone because they're worried about them. So it's just like, so I mean, you have to decide for yourself how much contact is enough for you as you're going through the grieving process, and where you are not getting enough, it is nobody else is necessarily going to recognize that you need the contact. So you're going to have to find ways to reach out, and let people into the experience too, because not everybody will naturally work out what you're going through.
And that can change, because sometimes you'll want to withdraw and times you'll want more contact, and again, everything will shift and no one else will know what you need but you in that sense.
Yeah. And so being able to communicate what you need in a given moment in time is going to be crucial to being able to navigate through the grief process. And to be able to then also resist the pressure from others to actually either go through the grief process faster than you would like, or to grieve in a way that is not congruent to who you are. So, so all of that can be said. Now, you might sit there and think, well, is there any order to this? And actually, my experience is that no, there's not. It's like you might start with one, you might jump to it, you might jump over to sadness, a cluster of sadness, regret, and guilt for a while, coupled with some anxiety about the future. And then that might kind of ease off a bit. Then you might experience a lot of anger, but then you're feeling in limbo at the same time. And then you might go back to sadness again. You might feel the loneliness and isolation creeping in over time. So that every person will have a different experience of how they navigate through that. But one of the couple of things that you might want to notice that will help you to know that you're coming out of the grieving process are these two things: your experience of resignation or acceptance. Now, they're two sides of the same coin. So I want to talk just quickly about resignation. Resignation basically is not doing denial. It's not doing bargaining. It's actually coming to a place of recognizing, I did experience this loss and it's changed my world. And it's changed it for the worse. And I can't see that it's going to get any better, so I'm just going to have to lump it because that's just the way it is. Okay, so that's kind of like, I can keep on living, but I don't expect to have a happy life because this loss has happened. Okay, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is acceptance. And acceptance basically says, yes, I experienced the loss. It was hard. It was horrible. I haven't enjoyed the process. And I'm now seeing that there can be some good that comes out of it. Not the good that I wanted, or not the good that I thought was coming in my life, but there's something else that can come in that can be just as good, even though it's not what I thought I wanted. So that's got a more positive slant to it. It's sort of, and that's, to me, both of these are attempts to integrate the loss into my new world and to create the new world here. It's like the resignation says, okay, the loss is here. It's going to influence me for the rest of my life, and I can just expect that, okay, life's probably not going to be as great as it was before the loss. Okay, I can deal with that. The acceptance is life can still be good in spite of what's happened to me. And you may flip between those two things as you're going through the grieving process. These things may show up earlier, but then disappear and then come back again. But what I get people to notice with this is like, how long is it lingering for each time it's here? So if it's lingering, the longer it lingers, I would suggest the further you are into your grieving process. So if I'm spending more time in acceptance or more time in resignation, I probably worked through a lot of other things to get to that place. So yeah, so that's kind of where things kind of sit. So putting that together with the external symptoms of a grief process, we've just got a whole package of things that can be going on here. So the internal stuff are the colored circles, and the external stuff are the white words there. And all of those things can be impacted by an experience of loss, and will probably be part of your grief process in some way, shape, or form. Okay, again, as I said, every person's experience is different. You may not experience all of these things, and it's okay if you don't. You may experience just a few. You may experience just one side of this chart, or maybe just the bottom or the top bit or something, but the loss experience always starts with the loss going into shock, and where it goes from there is anybody's guess. So your past experience of loss will also play into your experience of grieving in a current situation. So if the current loss is very similar to a loss you've had in the past, you may find yourself actually going through a similar process to what you did the last time, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. The challenge with losses that are similar is that you'll sit there and say, well, I made it through the last time by doing this, so if I do exactly the same, I should be fine. And that's not always the case, because the loss the second time round may have nuances that the first one didn't have, or vice versa.
I think it shows just how a complex grief can be. I mean, obviously for some people it can be very simple, but at the same time it can also be complex and overwhelming in how it changes and how it moves and all those things.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that one of the myths that is out there is that we believe that grief should be very linear and very straightforward and very short. And honestly, we're dealing with matters of the heart here. We're dealing with things of significance. We're dealing with things of importance. We're dealing with things that make us tick. And if you've had something that's been ripped out of you, it takes a while to recover from that. So to have the expectation that it's going to be short, it's going to be straightforward, it's going to be simple, is setting yourself up for incredible disappointment when your experience may be something quite different.
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic. Thanks for taking us through that. That was really good.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap up for today?
I'm just trying to think. We've talked about grief being normal and the tangible and intangible losses, about the timetable of grief and how there isn't really a timetable, and the different styles of grieving, and also the way that grief is much more than just the experience of sadness. So I'm not sure that I have much more that I want to say about this at this point in time. Is there anything more that you wanted to be curious about?
No, I think I've asked all my curiosity questions as they've come up. So no, I think I'm good.
Yes.
Good. Well, in that case, I just want to share how people can get in touch with you. So I'm going to share my screen instead.
Stop my share. Yep.
Let me do that. All right. So yeah, so I just want to say thank you Neville, for this amazing exploration and discussion of grief today. It has been phenomenal. I've learnt so much. And I love it when I can ask the source some questions about these things. If you would like to talk with Neville, there is his email, phone number, and link to, or not link to, Facebook page, how to find him there. And he is based in Australia, in Queensland. So that is an Australian.
Not in Queensland.
Not in Queensland. I keep forgetting that. You're in New South Wales, aren't you?
I am in New South Wales. Yes, on the border of Victoria. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that is an Australian mobile number, but it's available in all those different forms.
Yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn. If people would like to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can reach me through that as well. So just look up my name and you'll be able to find me. So,
and
yes.
I assume you offer everything over online as well as in person?
Yes, I can do face-to-face or online or phone if people would prefer. Just be aware that the online and the phone one, they've got limitations around what we can do and what we can cover. So if that's something that you're considering, we'll have a discussion about that as to whether or not that's the best thing for you.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been great.
It's been really good for me to sit there and talk about this stuff. It's like I work with people in this on a regular basis, and I find it really good to sit down and step back and take a look at what are the pieces of this experience of grief, and everyone's experience is so different that it's nice to actually sit there and say, here's a bit of a handle to help you to get a sense of what can happen, and to encourage the self-awareness. So thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to be able to be here.
Thank you.